and we talked about how we should lay out our environments first. Okay, you don't just jump in there and just start, let me build an environment. You want to lay it out, get a feel for the environment, where you're going to be setting your stuff up, what's going to be going on in the scene. So in this scene, I have just a very simple setup, okay? And the purpose for this is I want to show something we have to always keep in mind, which is render time, okay? So which rendering out of these two look better? This one or this one? A or B?
It depends on what you're going for.
A looks better, but I think that's something that you probably could do in post that would probably take way too much time rendering.
Okay, well, B, this one here, we could up it a little bit, but if you look at the ceiling, that's really the only big change in here. I mean, there is an overcast.
Flare, like,
Right. But the ceiling is like the huge thing, and if you look at the inside of this here, how dark that is, and then how light up that is, okay? So this is the difference between a 1 minute render and an hour and 8 minute render, okay? Now some of my stuff that I had on here, I actually took a lot of this off. I took a lot of my lights out of the scene because it was taking more than an hour, and I'm like, there's no way I can even demo something that's gonna take more than an hour. So I just took all that stuff off. Now this one has Final Gather on it. Final Gather is a nice tool, and it can be great if it's used correctly because it does do a nice job of filling in those extra lights. But what Final Gather gives us is this. See that circle right there and right there? And that circle down here? That's all from Final Gather. Okay, that's all from when Final Gather shoots these rays out to help bounce the light around the scene so we actually get like bounced lighting. That's what it gives us, is that. And so we'd have to tweak the settings a bit further in order to eliminate all of that Final Gather stuff, okay? So I don't want you to ignore your render time until the very last day before you're turning the stuff in, and then you hit render, and then it's like, why is it taking 8 hours to render my stuff? Yes, sir.
How long does it take to render like Unreal and stuff?
In Unreal, you're not rendering in there, okay? It does all the rendering right there, so it's live. Now one thing Unreal does that like this isn't doing is it automatically bakes everything in. So all your shadows and lights and everything is already baked in there. And as you move the camera around, it's basically just like a flat scene. So for an image like this, for an image like this, Unreal would actually bake in what this light looks like. It would bake in the shadow, it would bake in this highlight, not the highlight, the shadows. And then as you moved around the scene, the shadows would still be there, the lights would still be there. And so that's why Unreal does what it does, okay? For rendering out of any software like this, you have to keep in mind your render time. You have to. Right from the very beginning, when I start modeling stuff and texturing stuff and lighting stuff, I'm always rendering. And if you see that render time creeping up, you have to remember that once you add all the other stuff into your scene, once you add your lights, once you add blah, 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 it's going to take a lot longer to render, okay? So you can't let it creep up on you. I had someone last semester who was, 6 hours for one frame. And in some instances, yes, it's going to take 6 hours for one frame, as long as you're prepared for 6 hours for one frame. But when you're rendering 3 frames or 5 frames or 20 frames, you have to keep that all stuff in mind, okay? Especially they were doing a walkthrough, not only just the animation or the stills, but they were doing like a walkthrough, and obviously that took up a lot of time when you're talking about 6 hours a frame. Here's what we're going to talk about with asset creation, because it's obviously a huge deal because we are building a lot of assets in this scene. So in this scene, I have a very basic setup of walls and pillars and lights and stuff. Okay, I'm just going to grab all this stuff and throw it on a layer real quick and then turn it off. All right. So here is something I usually get is something like this. So now looking at this, what's wrong with it? It's straight.
One of them selected, the others aren't.
Nope. They're all separate pieces and subdivisions, okay? So having them be separate divisions isn't a huge deal because I could always move them and make them align so that they do lock together, but you can't really see it too good. But there is like a crack back here, and this is stuff that people don't pay attention to, is if you have it all separate, you have to make sure that they're lined up perfectly. okay? But even worse than that are the subdivisions. Anytime you have something like this, where you have a completely flat wall, there is zero reason to have all those subdivisions, okay? There's no reason at all. And all that's going to do is that when you hit that render button, it's going to take longer to render your stuff out. So I am very specific or particular about making sure that my surfaces do not have that many divisions. Look at this. It's just a box with very little divisions. Look at this. The divisions are only in the spots where I need them to be. This one has more divisions because I need those divisions to create that shape. And then inside the light, let me just pull this down so we can see it. Inside the light, I have a couple cylinders, and then I have these little plates, and then I have this little bounce sheet on the back.
You didn't smooth any of these, or you did?
I hit 3. That's all I did. So 3.
I thought you got a smooth one.
That's only when we go to an external program like KeyShot. In Mental Ray, it'll read the 3 being smoothed out.
Gotcha.
Okay. I didn't put any poles above these. I don't need poles above them because I don't see the poles above me. So there's no point in having them there and doing that. I also have 2 sets of lights. For something like this, I have these lights that are supposed to like cast downward. That's what they're supposed to do. But in Maya, we can't make a light just cast downward and cast upward like a fluorescent light would be. So I have these lights up here, which are my casting down lights. And then I have these lights right here casting up to make it look like this fixture is actually illuminating. Okay? So it does take some finessing to kind of play with that, which I'll show in a minute. First, I want to talk about creating our assets. So I'm just going to hide this again, and I'm going to create from scratch just a cube, or a plane. So if you have your environment that you've already kind of laid out, then you can use the basic shell of what you've already done. Okay, so if you have a layout of what you want stuff to happen, you can use that shell, and it's no big deal. You just have to manage your divisions. Now, in Maya, the scale does matter when we talk about lighting things. Okay, if you want your lights to be a completely 100% accurate, we need to make sure that our scale of the scene is completely accurate. We're dealing with centimeters here. So if we talk about centimeters, then 300 centimeters right now is 10 meters. 10 meters is about the height of one floor. Okay, so right now that's the height of one floor. So I'm just going to leave it at 300 for now and just say this is a 10 meter by 10 meter area, or a 30 meter by 30 meter. Yeah. I'm going to go to my divisions over here. I'm going to turn these back to 1 so that I get no divisions in the middle. Then I'm going to grab my edges and I'm going to extrude it. So I just extrude, shrink that down, pull it up. And I'll pull this up to, oops, I grabbed the wrong button. I'll pull that up to 300 also. Okay, so now I basically have a perfect cube-ish of what this is. Now I'm using perfect numbers. You don't need to use perfect numbers. As long as it looks good, who cares? All right, so now let's say I want to put a texture on here. For most surfaces that we're using, the Mila material in Maya should be the one that we use. This is the most bells and whistles material. It should cover a gamut of multiple surfaces that we're going to be using. So the Mila should be the material used on like 98% of your objects, and maybe 2% you would use something random else. Okay, not the other way around. So I'm going to assign a Mila to this. And of course, name your stuff. Every time I come to People Station, stuff is a name. So let's say this is the walls Mila. Okay. You'll see here that it has a base diffuse. A base component is diffuse. The great thing about this is you don't get 5,000 options if you only need 1, right? So if I just needed color, I could just pick whatever color I want. If I wanted to map something to this, I can click the map and drop on a file, and then go to my folder and then pick my file. So let's say I pick checker floor or concrete. There we go. All right, so I picked concrete for this, and I have a concrete floor. And now let's say that I rendered this out like this.
You hit all your lights.
I did hit all my lights, thank you. I also have Final Gather on still, so I gotta turn that off. So I'm just gonna, for now, throw in a point light, just so I have some sort of lighting in my scene. And I need to turn off Final Gather and turn my quality down. And I like to turn it down like way far, like 0.25 or even 0.1, just to get the idea of what's happening in the scene and make it go quick. Your goal is many iterations as you can. All right. So by default, that looks pretty decent. Obviously, it looks weird having my floor and walls and everything kind of lining up perfectly. I need to adjust some of those properties to it. Also, there doesn't really seem to be any texture to it. As if I get close to this and were to render it, it looks like a completely flat piece of concrete, but even though there's bumps on it, it's still flat, which doesn't really make a lot of sense, okay? So I want to add a bump map to this. So I'm going to go to I'm going to delete history on this. I'm going to go to my walls Mila, and under the material properties, here's where I add the bump. Now we have to do this in a different way than we may have done before. So I'm going to click on the map for it, and what we have to do is, in the hypershade, it would create a bump 2D, and then it would create our file. That's how it would create it. So we can't just go to file here because it doesn't create the other stuff we need connected. So I need to go to utilities and add a bump 2D. And then on the bump 2D, we have two things. We have the depth, which is how much it's bumpy, and then we have the value, which is where it's bumping. So I'm going to click on the map. I'm going to go to File. I'm going to go to Folder. And I'm going to choose that concrete picture again. So now if we look at this, you'll see that it actually looks like it has some bump, it has some texture to it. Okay? So you can definitely see there is some texture to this apart from just the coloring. Now, it isn't really enhanced a whole lot. It really isn't as apparent as it could be. One of the issues is that on this wall, there's no specularity. Bump relies on specular to make sure that it works. So I need to go back to my Mila and change this from simply a diffuse material to something else. And here's where the power of this one comes in. Because we can tell it, this is a diffuse scatter, translucent, or it's reflective, or it's transmissive. So basically, metals and plastics and paints, or glass, or just flat objects. So it's all like right there. So if this is a wall, I can probably stick with something like anisotropic. This paint is more of like a car paint, so I wouldn't go to that for the wall, obviously. It doesn't make sense. So reflective anisotropic is good. And then I can adjust things like my glossy blend, which is how reflective it is. And then my glossy roughness, which is just how sharp those reflections are. So now if I were to go through, and I'll just save this rendering, and I'll render it again. Again, I'm keeping in mind how long renders are taking. So far it was 6 seconds for the last one. This one will probably be about the same, maybe a little bit longer. And now this is going to look maybe a little bit better than it did before. I may need to pull the reflectivity up a little bit. I do have to consider, what is this material actually made of? Okay, that's your biggest thing. What is this made of? Look at that, 21 seconds once I added that in there. I'm going to go to Options, Test Resolution, and knock this down to 50%. That way when I hit the render button, it renders half size, so it doesn't take as long. I'm going to take the reflectivity up a little bit, that glossy blend. And then I'll render this again. And then we'll be able to tell what this is looking like further. I could also go into that bump and pull that bump depth up a little bit more. But the goal is we're trying to emulate a surface. In order for me to emulate a surface, I have to understand it. Looking at this wall right here, you can tell that it's reflective. You can tell that there is some light bouncing off that wall hitting this. That's where that lightness is coming from, is the reflectivity. So something like that actually looks pretty decent. Okay, that looks like it could be a concrete or cinder block-esque wall. Now I don't like the scale of it. I may want to scale the whole thing down. By default, this surface doesn't have UVs laid on it. This base one did, but these are basically, I'm not even sure why they're laid out the way they are. There might be a new feature inside of Maya where it started laying stuff out, but typically it wouldn't do that. So what I want to do is I'm going to grab this face, and this face, I'm going to go to UV, and I'm going to go to planar mapping. Oops. And I'm going to choose the direction that it's mapped in, or the direction it's facing. Right now, these two faces are facing the X direction. So I need to go to the X and project it. That's not the X. I had something else click there. This is Dylan's setting, so I think I'm going to blame him. I'm also going to hit keep image width and height ratio, and then project. There we go. Okay. So it looks like it's pretty much the same. I'm not sure why it laid it out when it did. But the neat thing is I can always adjust my scale with this after the fact. So if I wanted to add some repetitions in here, I could add some repetitions in there to get more stuff going on. Okay. And I'll also go to this back wall, and just to be safe, I will planar map that back wall. Okay, I like to make sure they're all planar mapped or mapped somehow. And then the floor, I don't want the floor to look like this. The floor looks not good like that, so I'm going to assign a new Mila to it. And I'll call this one floor Mila. I'm going to make this a reflective anisotropic. I'm going to click the color mapper, go to File, go to Folder, and go to Checker Floor. Okay, and this is a checker floor pattern that I found that I thought was pretty neat. Click back here. That's the walls. There's the floor. See how it's important to name these so you know what you're actually editing? Let's see. I'll have this one maybe be a little bit more glossy. That should be good there, actually. Okay. Maybe I'll rough up the diffuse a little bit. And then for the bump, I'll add a bump to this. So utilities, bump 2D, lower the value, the depth.
Is it bump 2D automatically? Oh, you're pulling the file now.
Right, I had to add that bump 2D manually and then do that. Now in here you'll see that I have two checkerboards. Okay, one of them is just the color and the other one is the bump. Whenever you deal with any kind of bump material or bumped object, you have to look at what's actually bumped out. Okay, so like this is a grime picture. That's what I used for my walls in that example. What I wanted to have was just some sort of sludge or something maybe creeping in from cracks. So I added this as just a separate item on top of it. But when I went to my bump, I didn't want that to bump out, because that would look weird if that grime was like bumping out or pushed in, because it's just more of a discolor than it is like an actual like moss or something that'd be growing on top of it. So when I created my bump for this item, I had, oops, not that. I had this here for my color, and then I had that for my bump. And you'll even see that I adjusted my colors so that my whites were a little bit more apparent, so that it wasn't bumping everything. Because if I did this, it would try to bump every single one of these pieces here, and that might look weird having like too much bump on there. Okay, so I kind of softened it a little bit like this, so I don't get as much bump in those areas. So for my checker floor, I did the same thing. Here's my checker floor. Now here, it would actually bump this blue tile and this red tile and this white tile differently because they're different values. So in Maya, it would actually maybe bump the blue one up higher, the red one in the middle, and the white one up even higher than that, or lower, or whatever. So I created this other one that does something very similar, but is based on these colors. So it actually has more softness or more overall coloration to it. And I could go into this, and I could pull these values down more, and maybe wash it out or give it more contrast, something like that. And you see how now all these tiles pretty much have the same coloration to it. Okay, so I'm going to save this as bump 2, so I don't overwrite the original. And now when I come in here, I'm going to grab bump 2, and we can see how now this is bumping out. Oops. Just these tiles the way that I wanted those tiles to be bumped out, and the ground between them is staying pretty static. So the tiles actually bump out of the ground, which is what they should do, and the ground is just underneath. And then again, we render it, we take a look and see what it's looking like. Right now, it's obviously too reflective all over the place. But then I should take that into account too and say, okay, well, if I'm looking at this, these tiles probably would be very reflective, right? If this was an actual brand new kitchen tile floor that we put in, the tiles would usually be very reflective, and the grout junk underneath would not be reflective, right? So if I look at this bump again, I have essentially that right here. If I look at the black, I can use the black as areas where I don't want reflection and the white as areas where I do want reflection. So let's do that. So I'm going to go back into here on my glossy blend. I'm going to click the little mapper. I'm going to go to File, and I'm going to find that glossy, or that bump 2. And what's going to happen here is that when we render this, instead of this bump or this gloss being all over it, it should isolate it to just the tiles, okay? Instead of isolating it to everything. Now my bump may be too big. Let me hit escape. Let me go back to that. Let me take this down to 0.05. And I think I also need to take my glossy roughness. That's the walls. Oops, see, that's what I did wrong. I put it on the walls one. Take that off. That's why it didn't look right. Put it on the floor, and that would look right. File. Glossy blend. There we go. All right, so now this is on the floor material and not the walls. And so then we should see something a little bit more different. Nope, still needs to be adjusted, so we'll go back. And I'll take this glossy roughness up. I'll go to this bump, take this one down. And I keep playing with this until I get something that I'm happy with. You can't just like say, oh, it's good enough and move on. We have to keep playing with it. So something like that seems a bit better. Now, we also have my light is up here, so I'm actually getting some extra specularity shininess right in the center because of my light right there. But if you look over here where these tiles are, we're getting a pretty decent result. This is actually starting to look like a pretty well created floor. It actually looks like it could be a real floor. All right, close that, close that. I'm going to take this and change my wall material. Let me hit delete history. I'm going to take my wall material and I'm going to change this. Instead of the regular concrete, I'm going to go with concrete grime. There we go. So we got concrete grime in there now. So it gives it a little bit more story having that extra stuff on there. All right, so these objects pretty easy. They're flat. I go into Photoshop, I put an image on it, and it's done. Planar mapping all day long. Everything works out perfect, okay? But then we're going to run into these instances where we don't have a flat object. What if we have an organic object that we want to paint specific textures on, okay? So let's do an organic object. So I'm going to create in here, let's say I created a cube. And I'm just going to make another pillar, and this one's going to be a little bit more organic in how I create it, okay? So I'm just going to do a little pillar right here. Scoot that down, extrude, scale it in, pull it up, extrude again, pull it up, oops, pull it up. Get up there. There we go. Okay. And then the same thing here. I want to take this maybe and just pull that up a little bit. That's good. And then I will add a bit of beveling to this too. Okay, I don't like things that have sharp edges. I want everything to be nice and soft. So I'll add some segments. That looks pretty good. All right, so now I have this pole in the center of it. Now, one thing I can do, and this is just a matter of how much detail we want to go into on these pieces. This is my material that I could use for this. So I can get fancy, and if I assigned a color and I assigned a ramp to this, look at how I can change this interpolation to none and then control where the color is. Right there. So I can assign where the black is, I can make this a different color. So I can make this, oops, let's say yellow. Just to make it obvious, and then for the white, I can make that gray. Okay, now it's not perfect. You'll see around here that it doesn't obviously look good at all right there. So maybe on this one, I'll go to UV and I'll do cylindrical mapping. Okay, because it's kind of cylindrical shape, like our the product example I showed. So I would use that. All right, now on my UVs, they're actually stretching out of the box. So I want to make sure that they stay in the box. So I'm shrinking it down and scooting it over, pulling these guys into frame. Okay. So that pushed this yellow line up, so I just need to go back to my ramp and just push it down. And I have a bit more control over it now that the UVs are laid out. So once I have this, that looks pretty okay. I'm going to go to my bump, and I'll add a bump to it. Utilities, 2D, 0.125, sure. And I'm just throwing numbers out there. I know it's going to be something small. Based on the numbers I had in my other ones, I'm just going off that. And then on here, I'll use this concrete. Okay, so now I actually have a concrete bump applied to my material, so it gives it that look. Even though I picked a solid yellow and a solid gray, it gives it the look of having some sort of texture to it, even though it's just flat coloring. And I probably built it right on top of my light, which is why there's nothing in my file. Let's close that. Let's find my light. There he is. Pull it out. And I'll just set him lower, like 0.5, and duplicate him, and I'll just put a light on this side too. Alright, so now we have some sort of texture on him. It doesn't look fantastic, but it looks okay. But let's again say, what if we wanted to add a bit more detail to this? What if we wanted to go crazy and paint a whole bunch of stuff on this? Let's say it's a murder scene, okay? It's a murder scene and there's blood all over it and guts and whatever else that we want to add to the texture of this thing. That's gonna be a little bit harder to do based on what we've already done, okay? So what I need to do is go outside of Maya. I need to play with another program in order to do that. So what I'm gonna do is, I'm gonna first lay out the UVs, okay? Now here, UV editor, I did lay them out, but they're not perfect. This is kind of just like, I don't care, I can tweak it afterwards because the file and everything is like self-contained. But I'm bringing this outside of Maya, I need to make sure it's lined up perfectly. So I'm going to assign a brand new material to this, and for this, it doesn't matter. I just like to use a surface shader just so I can see, there it is, everything perfectly. So I'm gonna map to the color a checkerboard. Okay, and I'm gonna go to the checkerboard repeats and go 10 and 10. Now what this is telling me is that this is stretched out vertically, so my texture, if I brought it in, would be stretched out vertically, which is why the texture on my other one didn't look perfect. It actually looked kind of funky. So what I need to do is tweak my UVs in order to get these to be squarer. So if I go to my UV texture editor, I'm gonna turn my texture off because I don't need to see it. I'm gonna go to my shell here and click on it. And if I just scale this up, there we go, you'll see how now these are turning into more squares than they were before, right? I want to check some of these areas, like stuff like this, that looks kind of funky how that turned out. They might be kind of squished a little bit. So there's another way that we can do this. I'm going to go to Edge, and I'm just going to double click at some key spots. Like right there, I would probably have a transition from one piece to the other where I have different colors. So I would do that. I'm also going to double click down the middle here, shift double click. And I'm going to go to polygons and say cut UVs. Okay? And what this is going to do is it's going to cut this apart into pieces. Now if you look at this bottom here, you'll see that this doesn't go all the way to the edge. So I need to make sure it goes all the way to the edge and then say cut. And then the same thing on the top, probably doesn't go all the way to the top. I'm just going to go to cut. There we go. All right. So now I've done that, what I can do is just grab this whole thing. Just grab this whole mess, go to polygons, and say unfold. And then what Maya's going to do is it's going to do its best to unfold it and try to keep everything square. Now it doesn't always do a great job. Okay? So that's where we need to come and play with this. Now this here could probably be cut also. So I think right there, yeah, there's like a tiny edge where these are connected somehow. So I'm just going to marquee all of those and just say cut. And then I'll just go through that and say move and sew. So I don't know why those are broken apart or why they're still connected there. They shouldn't be. Oh, maybe this? Yep, it's that. So I'll just grab that and say cut that off. And then sometimes you'll have to add an edge loop in the middle, and that will help. So like about, that's not the middle at all. Maybe there. And just for fun, I'll put a couple more. And then I'll break it right in the middle. So I'll cut UV edges there. Grab everything again. Polygons, unfold. And you can see it's doing obviously a better job than it was before. Now we do have an issue here because of the fact of how the spacing in this is laid out. It's not doing a perfect job. So what I'm going to do is just scale it up, and you'll see we get more squares in there than we had before. And it doesn't have to be 100% perfect, but it has to be pretty close. I'm going to go back to my checker. I'm going to change my repeats to like 30 and 30. And you'll see having more in there, obviously we get a little bit more accuracy in how we're getting those things to look square. All right, so that's good enough. Now I do need to make sure that this fits in this top square here, so I need to shrink it down so it fits. There we go. Okay, now I could cut this further, which is what I should do. That way I can grab this shell here and set it on the side, like that. And then scale all of these up to fit better inside here, okay? You want to maximize how much room you have inside this box. That box is your texture. So if you have a file that's this big, you want to use every bit of that file, because otherwise you're just wasting memory and making your renders take longer. So there we go. All right, so now I have this item. So I'm going to export this item out. Now we're going to go into this program called Mari. And Mari allows us to paint textures right on top of objects. Okay, there's a trillion features. I'm going to cover like 3 or 4 of them. That's all we need to do. We need to get in there, paint some stuff, and then get out of it. So when I go to new, what I always do, I haven't even exported it out of Maya yet. I want to see what Mari wants. And this is how I work all my programs. So if I say pillar, that's what this is. Where is my geometry? So I click the folder. And it says it's looking for an ABC, an OBJ, or a PTX. So I know that from Maya, I need to export this out as an OBJ. So I'm going to say export selection. I'm going to look at my list, and in here at the very bottom I find OBJ. If you don't have OBJ, you have to go to your settings and preferences, plugin manager, and turn on OBJ export. It's right there. Okay. So now I'm going to export this out. I'm going to say pillar OBJ export selection. So now when I come into here, I can find my file. It's on the P drive. It's on Sarcona 2520 work environment scenes. There it is. Pillars OBJ. Okay. So now it's going to use my UVs that I've already set up. I don't need any face groups. Merge geometry into one. I just have one. And then for my root path, I want to set this to my project. Okay, so I just set it right back to my source images because that's where everything's going to go. All right, so now I want to create just one map. I usually just create one map in here just to make it easy, and it's just the color map. What does the color look like? Okay, so I've only specified 3 things. I specified what object I'm bringing in, I specified where I want my root path to go, and I've specified I'm creating a texture. And that texture size is going to be 4K, which is a pretty... This is a huge texture size if you're doing games. That's way too much. But it's always better to paint at a bigger texture and then shrink it down later, as opposed to trying to create it small and then, oops, too small. All right, so I create that. And then inside of Mari, it's loading, maybe. There it is. It's opening up my file. Now what it should do is open up just this, okay? Now the controls are very similar to Maya in how we navigate, okay? There are several tabs up top. Typically I work in 2 tabs. I work in UV, which shows me the UVs that we brought in from Maya, and then it shows me the ortho. So I work in typically those 2 views, that's it. Over here on the right, we have an image manager. So I'm going to go and bring in my images. And these are just textures that I found, stuff I got from textures.com. So I go to P drive, I go to here, I go to 2520, where am I at? Right there, work, environment, source images, and I have this concrete I'm going to bring in. So I'll just drop that in there. I'll also bring the concrete grime in there. And then if I find something else I need, I'll bring that in too. So here's what's great about this. I can just drag this into here, and then here's all the hotkeys. So you see this list, radius is R, rotate is W, opacity is O, and so on, all the way down the list. My screen is kind of shrunken, so I don't see all of them, but I already remember what they are. Control-Shift is scaling, so you see how I can scale that down. Shift is moving, and then Control is rotating that texture. So here's how I can do this, is that I can zoom in. I can use 1, 2, 3, and 4 to jump to different views. And what I want to do is just kind of position this and then just paint. And so I'm literally just painting that texture right on there. So whatever I want it to look like, paint it. Now when I hit Alt, okay, you'll see that it goes into this spinning wheel mode. That's when it's writing the texture out. Okay? So I'm going to hold Shift, scoot this down a little bit more, and paint that. Hold Shift, paint this down a little bit more, paint that. Okay? I hit Alt again, and then we'll see that this is actually going ahead and it's painting right on top of my geometry. So if I want this bottom piece here to be green, I could just go in with a green brush afterwards and color it green. If I wanted to add a bullet hole, I can go find a picture of bullet holes, and I can paint bullet holes right on top of this. Now, as I spin around this, let me turn this texture off by going to my regular brush. As I spin around this, you'll see that we do have some weird stuff happening here. See that line right there? What happens is it projects it. So my texture is basically like a picture, and as it's projected here, stuff that's facing this way, it just streaks. Okay? That's why we're getting these little streaking lines right on the side. So what I'm going to do is come over here to projection. This controls all the parameters for how it's projecting onto the surface. So I want to say preview the mask so I can see it. And then down here under edge mask, yes, I'm going to turn this on. And now what I'm going to do is play with that start. Nope, play with the end. There we go. It was start. Is it just being finicky? Let me see. Fall off start, fall off end. You may have to type it in too. We're done. All right, so this should be working. I don't know if it's my screen or what, but it's not showing me the correct thing that it should be showing me, which is an edge mask. It's kind of doing it there. All right, that's it there. So I for whatever reason, I needed to adjust this like that. I never usually have to. And then I pulled that fall off start or fall off end up. There we go. Okay, so what this is going to do is as I paint on here, these red areas it will not paint in. Okay, so then as I start to paint, I'll go back to my projection brush. I go to paint, what it's going to do is not paint in those areas. Okay, now in this, I'm painting straight on because I hit 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 just to get to that right view. Okay, so it's switching views. But I could also spin around. So as I spin around, I can move this over here and paint. And you can see how I can fill that in. Now, when it gets to a certain point, you'll see that I'm getting a line like that because I don't have my repeat image on. So I can turn repeat image on, and it'll just repeat the image down there. Now, in this case, I don't want to do that because that image has a line on it. Okay, there's actually like a little weird line at the edge. So I'm going to turn that off and just hold Shift, move it, and then just paint that in. Spin around a little bit. There we go. And then paint here. Scoot it up, paint some more. Scoot it up, paint some more. Spin around a little bit. All right, so that looks pretty good. Right there. Oops. I guess this side I totally missed. Wrong button. Sometimes you'll jump to Photoshop hotkeys as you're in other programs. Okay. So now that's good there. So now I have this texture on here, which is exactly where I painted it. Okay. Now it's not terribly detailed because of where I painted it. I was actually pretty far away. If I pulled this up again like this, oops, like that, wrong one, and I scooted this over and I made it a little bit bigger. Come on, bigger. And I rotated it some. And I started to paint it. You'll see I get actually a little bit more detail inside this. You can see how tiny little speckles are because I'm up closer. I'll make my brush bigger. Okay, so it does matter where you're painting this. You may want to paint it up close to get a more high resolution texture. Okay, so that's what's nice about this is that you really have the ability to play with this if you can remember your hotkeys. Pull that down, paint that. And you have complete control over what's going where. Because it's basically just like a Photoshop where we can just paint. Like I want this to be here, and I want that to be there. Okay, now my first step I always do is I just paint a base layer. So this is just like what original color do I want this thing to be. Okay, you can see how horrible this actually looks on this bottom bit. As I paint with the higher resolution image, because I'm zoomed up closer, I get a much better, much nicer looking texture on it. Okay, now if I flip over to the other side, you'll see there's the old texture, here's the new texture. Now realistically, unless I'm going to see this thing from multiple views, I don't need to even paint the other texture, the other side of this if I'm not going to see it. But since we're here, we should paint it. So I'm going to go here and spin around, and I'm going to rotate, wrong button, rotate this, push this down. I'm going to spin around a little bit like that, and paint that. Now what I'm not doing is zooming in and out. If I zoom in and out, I'm going to lose my size that I'm currently at. So I stay exactly zoomed into this level. I'm not making the image any bigger or smaller. That way it'll be uniform all the way around. And you can use this, in the movies they'll actually use this kind of setup for not just like props like this, but they'll use it for like people. If they wanted a person to be looking a certain way, they'll bring pictures of the person in there and they'll paint right on top of the person to make them look exactly the way they want them to look. Alright, so there we go. So that should take care of all that. Perfect. Okay. So now let's say that I wanted to add a little bit more color to this instead of it being just gray. So I'm going to go to my layers, and there's layers down here, and I'm just going to add a new layer. And this layer I'll just call change color. And if I'm on this brush, this is just like a regular paintbrush. So just like you're painting blue or green or red, that's what that is. So if I go to here and I pick my color, like let's say I wanted that bottom piece to be like an orangey color like that, I can do that, and I'll zoom in, and then I can just paint that orangey color right on top of it. Now what it's doing is it's so dark, it's basically eliminating that color that's underneath, right? So just like Photoshop, we have different adjustment layers that we could do. So I can come over here and play with all these different adjustment layers and see if I find one that blends nicely. So this one, which is add, I lose the darkness, but I get a nice bleed through with that color. So that might be something I want to do. Maybe not now, but another time. This color multiply, this is darkening it. It's hard to see on the projector. It's darkening it, and we're seeing some of the texture through it. So I could use that. I could use color burn. Okay, that one looks pretty good. Overlay. Vivid light. Okay, so I can play with the different ways that this is interacting with it. And in the process, I might say, hey, it might be kind of cool to do a blue one too. Like not just like all these orange, but maybe I'll have a blue and an orange. I can come back later and show how to do that. Okay. So that contrast one looks pretty decent. So remember that contrast one.
Now everything in our scene is going to be using Mari, or is you just showing it this?
You should use Mari at least on a couple objects in your scene. because that's where really you're going to get the realism of it. Because otherwise it's flat. Everything's flat. And there's no actual painting where things should be painted or detail where they should be detailed. All right, so I'm going to go with soft light. I think that one looks pretty decent. Or what was the other one? Multiply? Vivid light? No, multiply was good. All right, I'm going to go with multiply on this one. Okay, so it paints that in there. Then I'm just going to go around and just paint on this whole thing. And as I'm painting, it's just updating that stuff. It's just updating that color information on that layer, just like Photoshop. Now, if you're going for video games too, if you're going to do this in Unreal, you would use the same process. One of these, flow, opacity, radius. No, my brushes are over here. It's a weird spot. It's under shelf. And then here's your brushes. So I need to leave you a little harder brush when I get to that. Okay, and I may even go hit 1 just to kind of line this up perfectly. And at this point, I'm going to turn that projection off because I don't care if it stretches because I'm doing a flat color anyway.
So even if you have blends and all that for Unreal, like you still gotta put.
You would still go into Mari to make your actual textures because it's not just it's the color really that's going to make it look realistic.
Right. So that we would just do like a blend and all that, 'cause we can't attach anything.
Right, right. You would just do it onto a blend instead of a Mila. Whoa. Alright, so now I'm just painting this right here. Perfect. And there's other ways to do it too. I don't use Mari a whole lot except for doing this kind of stuff. Now it isn't, one thing that's not doing, I don't have my settings turned on to paint through the object. So all it's doing is painting the surface that I'm seeing right now. There we go. Okay. So now I have this, gorgeous, it looks like a different color, exactly what I wanted. So now let's say that I wanted something else on here, like blood or whatever. Textures.com. Log in.
Now, is that like worth the same for like glass and stuff?
Yes, let's say you wanted glass, but you didn't want just flat glass, you wanted the glass to look like it has some dirt or guck or whatever else on it. You would still paint a texture inside of here, or whatever, that you would bring in. Now, if it's flat, you don't need to paint a texture on it. Okay? The reason I'm doing this is because I have a specifically shaped object, I need to make sure it's placed the correct way. Okay? Blood. There we go. Oh, there's a handprint on it. It's creepy. Let's get that. Still have 15 credits today. Oops.
This site you get 15 credits a day.
15 credits a day. And you know what sucks about Internet Explorer is that on these computers it doesn't download. So I have to go to Chrome, go back to and one day I'll remember that. I'll probably remember it on May 15th. We're all done with this semester. I can just jump to my favorites now. Alright, so here's the bloody hand. The smaller image, I'm just going to grab that. Show in folder. There it is. Alright, so I'm just going to open up Mari again. There it is. I'm going to go back to my image manager. I'm just going to drag splatter fabric is what it's called. Just drag that in there. And then drag it in here.
There's no opacity on it though, huh?
What was that?
There's no opacity on it.
Correct, there's no opacity on it. But watch what I can do. If I go to my layers, I'll make another new layer. And I'll call this bloody. It's bloody hand. I'll zoom in. So obviously I want this to be in a specific spot. It makes no sense to have a bloody hand way up high because I'm not going to see it, and then how would it get there? So come on, right there. It's a little bit tricky sometimes to navigate. So here where I made a mistake, I'm going to put the bloody hand right there. So shift, rotate, scale it down so it makes sense. And then I can just paint the bloody hand right on top of it. And then I can go back to my modes, and one of these modes would most likely make that white disappear. If not, I can always go into Photoshop with the image,
Overlay.
tweak it.
You gotta roll out of your,
Yeah, overlay should have worked.
well, you gotta roll out. You're looking at
Oh, right. I'm still looking at my image. Duh. Thank you. I'd be surprised how often I do that. There we go. So something like that. Where is
multiply or overlay.
multiply would work. There we go. So that looks like a weird spot anyway. That's a good thing about doing it on a layer is I can just go to my erase, and then I can just go to my erase. I can just go to my color and come on. Come on, buddy, multiply. Alright, I'm going to leave it there for now. I could go to my, so I just have it on this layer here. I could just delete this layer, remove layer, and make a new layer. Call that bloody. Drop my hand in here, put it in a better spot, like right there. Oh, that's why my erase didn't work. I didn't move. Okay, so you come down here, you zoom in. Shrink it down a little bit. Okay, so now we'll take this, paint that on there. If I need to, I can switch to my eraser, erase the edges of this, switch to a brush, hard surface brush. They even have like oily and speckles and whatever. And obviously a stylus tablet really helps. Alright, so let's say that, and I'll just switch this to multiply. And now we have this kind of bloody print right here, and I'll add some drips to this as well. New layer, set it to multiply. Actually, I'll set that to normal. Oops. Oh, bloody, you're on multiply. No, I did not hit the Alt again. I always do that. Okay, then I can add some little gouges here, maybe add some rusty blob. And there's an eyedropper, so if I go to, come on, this, I can eyedrop some of that red. It is. Go back to my brush. And add a little bit more splotchiness around it. Okay? So, very quickly I can go in here and say bloody. Alright. Alright, so very cool. So now I can take this and go to channels. And this is where my texture resides. It's inside this color channel. So I just right click and say export. Export the flattened version. Current channel flattened. And what it's going to do is it's going to put it inside my folder when I say go to my folder. So I go to my P drive here to there. Okay. So instead of this being called channel, I'm going to call it bloody orange. And I'll put pillar in here too. There we go. Okay, so there's my orange pillar. Then I can go back to my change color. And remember we had that other one which was, I think, exclusion. There it is. And so now it's blue. So now if I go here and I change this, and go to color and say export flattened current channel. And instead of it being bloody orange, I'll say bloody blue. All right, so now we're back in Maya. So that's all the Mari does. It just creates textures for us that we can apply to our objects. So I have 4 pillars, so I'm going to assign a Mila to pillar number 1. I'll call this blue pillar. And I'll go to my file, I'll go to here, bloody blue pillar. We'll give it a second. There it is. And you'll see how it comes in with that texture we just painted. And if I spin this around, there's the bloody hand. Okay, and then I'll go to this one, and I'll make another new Mila. And that'll be my orange pillar. Now, keeping in mind too how many of these we would bring in, if I brought in too many of these full res textures and used them over and over again, number one, this is like weird. Why would the same handprint be exactly in the same spot on 2 pillars? And number two, there might be like too many textures, like too big of a texture loaded on these things. So I may need to lower res some of these textures. But that's the neat thing about Mari too, is that I could just hide these two, and now I just have a plain blue pillar, save that out, and then load that as another pillar image. Change this color back to multiply, then I have it back to the orange, and then I can save that out as the other one. I could also go into this and erase. Why don't you let me erase? Oh, right. I don't erase in here, that's why. I go to a new layer mask, that's what I do. And the layer mask allows me to paint to hide stuff. So I need to make sure I'm painting in black and white. Black. There we go. So now as I paint this, you can see how I'm scuffing up that texture a little bit. So it's just like a layer mask in Photoshop, I can paint layer masks inside of Mari too. I can help blend these surfaces in a little bit better so I don't have this weird bump right there. And as long as you saved your Mari file, you have a lot of room to tweak and play and do other stuff.
I'm guessing you can download different brushes and stuff.
Right, you can download different brushes. These are actually use the same brushes as Photoshop, so if you wanted to get Photoshop brushes, you can use those right in here too. They're just black and white images. But this gives you obviously a lot more control than dropping images on top of this one after the other. It really helps you customize your scene. Now, for 80% of the or 75% of the items in your scene, you may use just flat textures on it or repeated textures that you've done. But for some of those key objects, you really want to use Mari to help pull those out and make them specific and make them unique. I may not do this for every single one of my pillars. I may have just the flat orange on all my pillars, but that blue one's special. There's something about that blue one that I want them to pay attention to. So I color it blue, I put the red hand on there, and now the viewer is a little bit more connected. Like, why am I looking at the blue one? What's so special about the blue one? And then maybe that helps tell my story a little bit better about what's happening inside my scene, okay? So as much stuff as you can use, not use Mari for, obviously the better for you as far as time goes, but the more stuff you add to Mari creates a more realistic view. When they do stuff for movies, a lot of times they're trying to use, they're trying to make stuff look as realistic as possible, so they have to go into programs like Mari or Substance Designer or a bunch of other stuff that's out there to play with, okay? So on at least 3 objects in your scene, make sure you've used Mari, okay? The next assignment after this is going to be very heavily done in Mari, so we want to make sure that we're using Mari at least a little bit so that when we get there, we're ready to go. I could have used it for the walls right here. That wouldn't have been an issue, but I really didn't see a need to because they're so flat. If you had something crazy, and I'll just make something really crazy just so you get an idea. I don't know what this is. It's just something random. Like that. Oops, like that. Like that. It'd be very difficult to get a texture on here and to get stuff laid out in the exact spot you need. Let's say this is a lance. You know, someone's been stabbed with a lance. We need to add blood on this, but only in certain spots. If I wrap the blood around it, it's going to look fake, because what's going to happen is the blood's going to all pool this way, but really it should be kind of pooling that way, you know, or whatever. So that's where Mari comes in, where we can paint exactly what we want. If we put some screws on here, and I'm just going to duplicate this and pretend it's a screw. Just pretend that that's a screw right there. Okay? If I bring these into Mari, I can say, okay, where these two surfaces intersect, I want to put a little bit of rust underneath it, because that rust will make it look like that screw is kind of rusty, and now I have this bit of rust dripping from that. Okay? So if you're using Unreal, or using Maya, using whatever, this is the same process. You still go into Mari, you still paint textures, you still bring it back in here, make sure it looks good. The only difference is that when you're using Unreal, you'd most likely jump back, into Photoshop, reopen these files, and here's what these pictures look like. Crazy. You can still edit them in here too, so if you did want to edit something like these little spots here, clone stamp, click. I can still edit that and get rid of that blue stuff wrapping right there. You would want to go into here and then resize it. So depending on how big the item is in your scene, you may want to go to 512. If it's something tiny like a little book on your desk that was really far away, you may want to go to like 128 or something. Okay? But you have to keep it in these dimensions, 64 or 128 or 256 or 512. And then I would also rename these so that you know what they are. Sized. There we go. So now when I come back to Maya, I can just reload this. Click here, find my sized one right there. And you'll see that that little blue splotch is gone, where it had that little step in here, like that, is now no longer there. The hand obviously is not as detailed as the previous hand, but for video games, you really can't have it be super detailed. Okay? For video games, you have to down-res everything because you have so much stuff happening in the scene that it has to be a lower quality. So that's the trade-off there. Now, if you don't have a whole lot of stuff in your scene, then obviously you could go a little bit more on it, but just be wary that you may have to adjust your textures in order for that to fit. Okay? So, start laying out your stuff, start building items inside your scene. If you need specific help on how do I model a cat, try modeling a cat first, obviously, and then look at tutorials online, ask me, ask your friends, figure out how you would model a cat. I have a bunch of tutorials for modeling random items on my YouTube page. It's gonna say, hey, it pulled it up first time. That's how popular I've gotten. Look at this, 4 days ago, 38 views. I don't know how many people have that. So all of my stuff here, 2520. There you go. All of these videos I put, this is all my playlist ones. So this fish one, this is actually how do you model a fish in Maya, how do you lay out the UVs, how do you bring it into Mari, and then how do you bring it back into Maya. That's all these two videos are. But there's a bunch of other ones here, like how do you take a dragon into Mari and paint the texture in there. How do you use ZBrush, if we need to use ZBrush yet. Here is that stuff, here's hand. Here's some other stuff, how to build street corner stuff. So I go through a lot of things. Okay? I think I start every video with the words alright. So here's me modeling a fire hydrant. And a lot of this is just kind of breaking it down. And it may be that, you know, you wanted to add a fire hydrant to your scene and this is like what you need to do. When I start modeling something, I don't always know what I'm going to do. I kind of play around with it. I kind of look and tweak and see what's going to work and what's not going to work. And because I've been doing it for so long, things just become a lot easier as you do it. And here's some more stuff. How do I model a bike rack? And how do I model chains? How do I model signs? How do I model that? And you'll see in a lot of these I'm pulling up reference, because just like drawing, having reference alongside what you're doing definitely helps understand what it's supposed to look like. Okay? So focus on the big items first. Focus on the big area items, where things are going to be laid out in the room, and then kind of work down into these smaller areas of what's most important. Okay? Any questions?